Okay, so we're ready to go. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you find yourself on this beautiful day. Thank you so much for joining us in this very important conversation. I'll just start by giving a brief overview of what this project is and how kind of we've come to this point and how the project has sort of taken form of its own. So we began in 2021, really seeking to hear from Indigenous women living with or having lived experience of HIV or Hep C, while also experiencing gender-based violence within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a mouthful as much as a very loaded conversation. So it's really courageous, the conversations that we had with these women, gender fluid, two-spirit, and transgendered peoples. So yeah, we heard some incredible testimonies over the last year. We engaged in the 4 directions, coming together virtually. Despite the pandemic, we were able to continue with this good work. And from that, our project came to an end. We engaged with these women. We heard their incredible testimonies and recommendations as they would give us recommendations, what they wish they would have had if they could have, like going through that again, what resources would have helped them. So luckily, we actually received renewal funding to continue this project to actually create resources directly out of the recommendations that we heard from these women. So one of our resources today is this conversation with these incredible people. And as you see, we have a graphic recorder who is going to be capturing what we're saying in real time, which is just so far out. With that, so a bit of background with the project. I'm going to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for all being here. Our beautiful Elder Betty for doing the opening in such a good way, really grounding us today. And so cool that we're coming from across this great nation. So I will start with introducing Ashely Smoke. If you just want to say a bit about yourself.
My name's Ashely Smoke. I'm a two-spirited parent from Ontario, from Alderville First Nations. My spirit name is Gatherer of Medicines for the People, and I do a lot of work around drug use advocacy and substance use and mental health. And I recently, through COVID, actually was experiencing gender-based violence. So I think then doing work on this project kind of made it come full circle, and my healing journey really unfolded. So I really appreciate the opportunity today. Thank you.
Miigwech, Ashely. And Flo, if you could introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody from BC, or afternoon. My name is Florence Ranville. On my father's side, I am Sioux Lakota and French, and on my mother's side, Woodlands Cree, Scottish and French. And I have 7 children, 4 grandchildren, 2 more on the way in the new year. And I've been living with HIV. This month is 24 years for me. I also, I was diagnosed with Hep C in '98, and I went on the old interferon in 2002. Which I cleared for my hepatitis C. And I've been working in anti-violence community work and activism for over 20 years now. I'm also a survivor of gender-based violence, and especially around the stigma with HIV included. And I'm so happy to be a part of this project and be a part of this during a time of action that really needs focus for us Indigenous women, especially those living with HIV and Hep C also, because we deal with stigma and so much gender-based violence with having those to live with as well, when we should be cared for as Indigenous women, always. Thank you.
Miigwech, Flo. And we'll go to Ann.
Hi, I'm Ann Favel. I'm from Winnipeg, Treaty 1. I'm a survivor of gender-based violence, and my spirit name is Thunder Bear Woman. I do a lot of work with research, peer research. I'm a peer research assistant. Sorry, um, I'm not really feeling good, but I'll continue. I also am a full-time student at Red River College and for child and youth care program. I am so honored to be a part of this panel, and thank you.
Miigwech Ann. And Sandy-Leo.
Good morning, everybody from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam in British Columbia. My legal name is Sandy-Leo Laframboise, a name that I changed in 1981 when I had sex reassignment surgery from male to female. Therefore, I'm a two-spirited trans woman. My father's Algonquin, my mother's Cree French Métis. I moved on these territories in '87, and I was adopted by the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, where I lead two-spirited sweats. And the name that they gave me was Kele Laslanai, which means butterfly woman. I am a survivor of sexualized and gender-based violence. I'm also a survivor with lived experience of hepatitis C. And for about 40 years in my life, I've been an advocate, peer researcher. Some people look up to me as an elder, as a two-spirited elder. It's a huge responsibility. And I've always advocated for the houseless, harm reduction, and access to ceremony in all aspects of healthcare. So thank you.
Miigwech. And I'll let Elder Betty introduce herself if she would like.
Well,
Didn't already.
not much to say outside of, I know I'm on Treaty 4. My home reserve is at Patwayak, which is still it's in Manitoba, but it's still Treaty 4. I teach in university and in public schools and sit on many boards and do as much good as I think I possibly could. And I'm just honored to be asked to sit here as an elder and bring prayers and ask the ancestors to surround these phenomenal women. It's just, I don't know. They're all so wonderful. But yeah, that's it for me.
Miigwech. And we'll move to our incredible artist, Devin. She can introduce herself. Let you know what she's working on over there.
Hi, everyone. My name's Devin. My pronouns are she, her. I'm drawing some visual notes for you today from Guelph, Ontario, just outside of Toronto. I'm a mother of 3, and I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for sharing your stories and for being so generous with them. And I'll do my best to, draw some illustrations and visuals and capture some of the ideas from today. Thank you.
Miigwech. And then my colleague, Savannah Swann from the Dr. Peter Center.
Thank you, Sally. And I want to say thank you to Elder Betty for the beautiful prayer and opening. I'm joining from the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as Sally said, my name is Savannah Swann. I am of mixed ancestry, Persian and a mix of European. And I work at the Dr. Peter Center, and I coordinate the Wellbeing Project with all of these wonderful people. And I just wanted to give a few notes on safety in this space. So during this webinar, our beautiful panelists will share their perspectives on the impacts of gender-based violence on Indigenous women, two-spirit, gender fluid, and trans people living with HIV and hepatitis C. And while our goal is to hold a trauma-informed space for attendees, we recognize that we can never guarantee safety in the virtual space. So please be advised of the sensitive nature of this topic and take care of your needs accordingly. The panelists have been advised to provide a content warning prior to sharing any potentially triggering details. At any time, you're welcome to turn down your volume, step away from your computer, or leave the webinar. If you're not in a space to attend or stay within the webinar, don't worry. As Sally mentioned, a recording will be available after the webinar. If you require any emotional support, I will provide a number of crisis lines and both phone and chat lines that you may access at any time. And in the event that you require emotional support for an elder, you may send me a private chat and I'll provide you with a separate meeting link where you can speak to Elder Betty. And as always, please message me if you have any questions. We're really grateful to be sharing this space with you. And thank you. I will pass it back over to Sally.
Thank you much, Savannah. So I'd like to recognize that we are here today for Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week. As well, I think I should have included in my little overview that this project has been led by CAAN, so that's Community Alliances and Networks, as well as the Dr. Peter Center. So it's been a collaboration piece, and it's been really incredible so far. For the panelists, as well as participants, I'll just let you know that we have our questions set. As well, they will be having about 5 minutes roughly to answer each question. We will give gentle reminders if we're kind of going a bit over, but generally speaking, we'll be pretty flexible. And then after this panel discussion, we do have the opportunity for questions and answers for the panelists. So we'll just be monitoring if you have your hand raised or if you want to put it in the chat, and we'll go from there and kind of navigate questions as they come in. Okay, so without further ado, I will ask the first question. I'm going to start with Flo. And we're just going to go around the circle and then everyone will have a chance to answer each question, or of course pass if they don't feel like they want to answer that one. So Flo, so this is the first question. How can health and social service providers support Indigenous women, gender fluid, transgendered, and two-spirit people who are living with HIV or Hep C and who are experiencing gender-based and sexualized violence during emergency situations? For example, what we all just lived through with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thanks, Sally. You know, it was brought to everybody's attention, especially during COVID and when it first started, like the numerous calls and numbers that went to anti-violence organizations. Their numbers, like their crisis line was blowing up. There was such an increase because, you know, Indigenous women, especially those living with HIV or Hep C, we were actually stuck at home with these partners that usually go to work for 8 or 9 hours. But here we had them there with us 24/7, you know, in that cycle of violence, that tension that could only maybe build a third or a quarter of our life with that abuser. It just was actually more constant, and especially if there's children involved. I myself, I grew up witnessing violence, you know, with my father and my mother. And, you know, for so many years, I believe that's how you showed love. It took me numerous teachings in my culture and ceremony to understand that's not how you treat women. And when we have a pandemic that comes in that's so scary and took so many lives, took so many of our elders and our seniors, you know, we look at this as where can service providers help as best they can. Like out here out west, we have so many single room occupancy hotels and old hotels that have been turned into it for people to go live in. And they're not just, there's only a couple that are just for women. The majority of them are mixed. And, you know, there's always a 24-hour staff on there. And I really believe that they have the means to connect with women, especially in those types of living situations, where they can have that opportunity to safely have them either removed from the SRO and maybe be put into a safer place for them to stay away from, you know, the gender-based violence they go through. Also, you know, like we don't have a lot of transition houses. And I know we mentioned it through the research project, is like something I really, really hope can be brought into place for women is, you know, you remember when we used to have those squares on our doors in our houses? It was like a block. You saw a block which showed you it was a safe house for kids to run to if they were in trouble. That's something that I think too, that service providers need to have right at their front desk or at their organizations to show like it's a safe place where a woman who's in trouble can run to or go to flee the violence and be safe, because unfortunately calling 911 is not always the safest for Indigenous women. Thanks, Sally.
Miigwech. And I put the question in the chat because I'm a visual person, so everyone can kind of reference that. We'll move to Sandy-Leo.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that response, Flo. I too witnessed gender sexualized based violence growing up and since a child as well. And it led me on a path of destruction in my life for a long time. It is service providers, agencies like the Salvation Army who helped me in that time period. Having said that, in that type of accessing services for a trans woman like me, you live in fear. You don't talk about who you really are because you're not receiving specific care for who you are, right? A lot of times service providers only provide siloed service. So as a person who survived violence, that's all they treat. They don't treat the whole a lot of times. And that's what I think is missing. Flo, you talk about less transitional housing, but I have to tell you, there's none for us. There's none. We have agencies who make policies to provide some access, but then what happens with that some access as a trans person, an Indigenous trans person, we're double stigmatized. And on top of that, you might even create another violent situation by trying to provide support and access for trans women, because a lot of women will not accept trans women as being women. And that creates unsafeness for both folks in an environment that is to provide safety for the situation you're living through. So how can service providers help? Is to have a specific area for trans women, gender non-conforming folks, because we exist and we're not trying to hurt anybody. We're fleeing from violence. And trigger warning here, my ex-husband stabbed me and he ran after me with a gun. He was my high school sweetheart and lived with me through my transitions and my hard times. So that was normal for me. And I accepted that for years and years and years. And so when I cleaned up and changed my lifestyle, I realized that there was no service specific providing care for trans women, none. And it still barely existed. We get accommodated, as I said, but you get the framework that you may create more violence, because emotional violence is just as awful as physical violence or rape. So thank you for hearing this and my words in a good way. I hope it's received in a good way. All my relations.
So powerful. Thank you, Sandy-Leo. We will move to Ashely.
So I would say like during COVID, leaving women stuck at home, like Flo said, with their abusers was the worst thing we could have done. And like, that's when my relationship ramped up and started becoming really bad. So I think, yeah, I think we need to do better in terms of like policy work and like that kind of advocacy for things like that. Like, I think instead of just jumping on bandwagons, we need to question some of these policies and actually like think about the repercussions of them. we need to create like safety plans when working with women who are experiencing gender-based violence, but like also safety plans in the event that no one's working, or like they can't get a hold of anyone, like where they can call people or where they can get a hold of someone should they need help. I think that was lacking too and could have been like an easy fix. I think also just like checking in however you can. Like I find that it would have been nice if someone could have like came to my house with a bag from the grocery store, you know, like with some supplies to make it seem like they were bringing me something. And while doing that, checking in on me. So like acting like you're a friend or something, you know, can be helpful, kind of covert service provision. And then when I was experiencing gender-based violence in my home, I went to so many agencies and asked for so much help. And like, I was met with a lot of like, well, we can offer court support, but there wasn't court in my life until I needed it, like until it was in my life, you know? So if there was that prevention aspect and people weren't like just focusing on what could happen, but like preventing issues, I think that would have been key. So like phone check-ins and counseling and like dealing with all the aspects of the self. I think that is a big thing. Like we focus on the gender-based violence when I think a lot of times we can focus on the mental, the spiritual, emotional, and like healing all the parts of the person. And I think oftentimes once you start doing some of that, you start realizing like how you can leave and how you can get out of those relationships. So yeah, I think just more thoughtful supporting and just connection to culture, finding elders. If you're not an Indigenous service organization, find elders, find culture, connect with the nations around and see how you can help women. But another thing is during COVID, even on my reserve, like I went there for help and everything was closed down. And that was really in detriment to a lot of people. So yeah, I think we should never, ever do that again.
Miigwech. Yeah, it's too often that things are compartmentalized into this box. You're dealing with this, so this is the service you receive. So I totally agree. Like a holistic approach from service providers would be incredible. And we'll move to Ann.
Hi, thank you. I'll go to the health, talk about the health services providers. With Indigenous women, safety issue. This is where when I was 16 years old, I got raped by 3 Caucasian men and ended up in a hospital. Right from the get-go, I wasn't treated properly. I was treated as a filthy little Indian, drunken squaw that deserved to get raped by these male. The rape kit that I went through was very rough. They didn't care how they treated me. The cops that were coming to talk to me saying if I needed a lawyer told me not even to try because going to court for this would be against me. I'd look like I deserved this, and where I didn't. I was beaten, I was raped by all 3 men, and I just couldn't live through that again. So I think what needs to be done with the service health care service providers is that they treat Indigenous women with respect, like a human being, like they matter. Like I just got out of the hospital. I was sick with influenza. They're missing me. I don't know if it was on purpose. And I'm telling them, this is my body, you're hurting me. And they kept on pushing that medicine in. Oh, it just stings a little bit. It'll go away. I'm there, no. Well, here then, she's trying to hand me the syringe. You do it then. Like, what kind of nurse does something like that? And I ended up with all that medicine, missed, a big lump in my arm, a big bruise, and she didn't care. Like these healthcare providers should care for each and every individual that they see. I'm a survivor of gender-based violence. I seen it through my parents. I seen it through me. During COVID, I don't have a man or a partner right now, but during COVID, I have a nephew living in here with us, and it's not that he's physical with us. He's emotionally, he's mentally, his voice. And a lot of people don't understand that words hurt deeper than a hit because they stay with you longer. They invest in your mind and they break you. So all violence against Indigenous women, not only living with HIV or Hep C, needs to be stopped. I'm sorry. It hurts me to see my nephew treat his mom the way he does. And you sit there and you wonder, should I go out and try to do something for her? And have that turned on you. Sorry. I think that's all I got. Thank you.
Jan, very powerful. And I think sometimes we think gender-based violence is, partner, but when it's your family, it's a just as devastating, maybe even more so when it's your own blood that can harm. I guess we'll move to the second question. All right, and so I will just pop that in the chat as well, but it is, how can health and social services integrate ceremony and other traditional healing practice into gender-based violence response? Let's pop that in now.
Back to me, hey? Hi.
Back to Flo.
Thank you, you beautiful women, for your stories. And I hear you and I feel you and I understand you. How can health and social services integrate ceremony and other traditional healing practices into gender-based violence response? Well, I know we have a hospital here in Vancouver, and I too can relate to what Ann was just sharing, because I almost died there 5 years ago. Whether it was because I was Indigenous or HIV or a previous drug user, sex worker. I was treated so badly there for 11 days. But, on the 4th floor there, they have created a, I believe it's a sharing circle, and you can smudge in there. So when patients come in, there's an Indigenous team in the hospital that's there to, I'm hoping that they are in touch with everybody that's identifying as Indigenous, and that we have responsible nurses and technicians and admin people that are going to say, because I know when I went there, I was surprised when I went a year and a half after, they asked me, do I identify as First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit? And I was just shocked. I'm like, wow, well, yeah. So the thing is, she's like, she asked me if she wanted her to put it in, right, in my file. I'm like, yeah, okay. But I think for when I've had like a peer navigator job, that's where I've come in with my elders and my teachings, where I've actually at different areas of where I've worked at different support groups for women, and have organized like a sweat lodge for women and made sure there was transportation and we got everybody there, because it's even just that introduction by me, myself, with say about 8 other women who now know it's just one SkyTrain trip on a Sunday and they can go do ceremony. Because if it's you're not going to really see that in the hospital. They do have a UEP ceremony in the basement, and I don't know when they've had the last one there, because since COVID, so many things stopped. Things are starting to come back, and I know sweat lodges have been really difficult too, especially for our elders and the medicine men and women that are pouring these sweats, as I'm sure Sandy could share about that too. But there's other ceremonies we can have too. We can have a sweat lodge even when you're sitting outside the sweat lodge, you know? So there's still ways to have that ceremony without it being completely exactly the way it's supposed to be. And to have smudge available for women, especially at a lot of anti-violence organizations that, you know, some of them have an Indigenous program with Indigenous counselors, which is great, but there are some that don't have enough of that. And we are usually given to a counselor that doesn't have that same background as we do. And that same unfortunate, you know, colonialism, everything that's happened to us, the oppression that's put onto us as Indigenous women, especially healthcare and social services. You know, like I believe like when I've walked in and I'm on disability assistance and stuff, and I walk into a social assistance office and they look at me, oh, look, she's Indigenous, of course, yeah, she's on disability, yeah. Like I didn't have a problem applying for disability, put it that way. Because they just looked at me and said, oh yeah, you know, there was no questions asked. And, but the system needs to do better. Like our healthcare needs to do better. And we need to do so much better, where why don't we have like our premier just is opening SFU doctors in 2026. We're going to have so many graduating, and I'm like, why can't we have like one like that for Indigenous doctors, right? Why isn't that just specific? You know, our people are smart, but you know, it's scary. Do we have the money to pay for 7 years of medical school? But it's important, because actually we have teachings that were given to us for free. We don't need to go to university for 7 years. That's our medicine, right? And that's what really needs to get out there a lot more. Thank you.
That's some good shit right there, Flo. That's awesome. Yeah. And, you know, there's so much investment into healing right now. And, you know, I think we all can agree that culture is healing. That's a huge part of any sort of, you know, healthcare system. So, you know, that sort of investment and allotment into resources just, you know, makes sense. So we will move to Sandy-Leo.
Miigwech, everybody. I just am from the West Coast, is what we say here. Holy moly woly. That is quite the question to begin with, and it's loaded, because most healthcare providers and service agencies did not do any of this integration until we rised up. We, the community, we, the women, the trans women, the gender non-binary, rose up and spoke. And even then, we still get stigmatized and chastised and set aside and, oh, you're the last drop in the bucket. We don't need to deal with this. So I believe that we can do it, and we ought to do it, to speak up in every service agency that doesn't do it. I have seen even in our Indigenous conferences, when we gather, we can't do smudge in a hotel. Oh, why? This is an Indigenous conference. Why not use our power, our purchasing power, our community voice power? So because of that, I've become the change that I want to see in the agency that I'm working with right now. And I stand up and I say things like, because it's very popular today to say things like, I recognize that I'm a settler on these lands, and I recognize that this. So I say, well, what does that mean for you? What does that mean for you when you say that? Is it an empty word? How do, in your actions today, when you say these words, what do you do? So I very gently in these ways, I ask the reverse question. What does it mean for you? What have you done? Is this the truth, or is this truth and reconciliation? Because if you're going to speak it, then you need to reconcile that you did not serve us. And if you want to serve us either better or really serve us, then you need to listen to us. So because of that, AIDS Vancouver has now hired an Indigenous support worker, has hired 4 Indigenous peer support worker, and has an entire indigenized program services, and created a advisory committee from folks who receive services, whether they're women or men or non-gendered or trans people. They meet every 2 weeks to discuss how to improve services and how to implement them for Indigenous people. Smudging is one thing you talked about here. And would you know that a lot of our elders that are not really versed in urban issues, and they come in, they will not smudge a person who's using drugs today or yesterday. And that's an unfortunate thing, but I mean, no disrespect to any of our elders, because they do a lot of good work, and we are all going to become elders at some point as we age. I just pray that we can remove the oppressive church theology out of our ceremonies in that way. So we need to work with elders in a good way to bring them up to say things like, you know, when you refuse to do that, you're not supporting the person in the moment, right? So using our voice in a good way, for those of us who have that voice. I led sweat ceremonies for Two-Spirited people. And when I have a group of people who are consuming drugs today, I would have a specific sweat for them, and I would put things in place so there's no harm caused to myself, the ceremony, or the people, because it's about safety, right? And ceremonies are intense and they awaken stuff when you're cleansing and you're letting go. And so to go further is to put a support for after the ceremony as well. The other part is during COVID, all of our sweat lodge grounds were closed down here in Vancouver at the Tsleil-Waututh, because we respected those things. Even when the fire season comes in from the province, we respect that in order to demonstrate that we can work together between the two systems that exist, the non-Indigenous Western system and our system. I know a lot of people don't, and that's great. They didn't, and that's great, but we decided to do that as a community. So that made it difficult for some of us. How do we do that? How do we do ceremonies in a prohibition time, right? Because it was an imposed government prohibition. Well, smudging, gathering 2 or 3 people and putting things in place. But smudging is not for everybody, because the West Coast, they use what we call cedar brushing, which is different than smudging. So that's the other part, is we need and ought to look at different nations' ways of being instead of indigenizing everything on a national level. Recognizing that we're dealing with national policies, each nation is their own sovereign entity on their sovereign land. And so ceremony of smudging may not be for one nation and maybe something else. So if we say with our words that we recognize the TRC, we want to implement them, then we also need to recognize that each nation, each region, each treaty is a sovereign entity on their own. And that's difficult when you're doing national policies, and education. I'm going to take Hep C, for example. I'm on the national roadmap for hepatitis C, and I'm also the chair of the hepatitis C committee at CAAN. And when we're talking about hepatitis C in English or HIV in English, and we translate that back in the local nation, sometimes it comes back, not for us, that's not what happens here, or your words mean bad blood. Oh, we can't deal with that. So we need to recognize that and take the time. I call it red flags. Slow down, take the time because it's important. It's different than when you're dealing with a crisis and the woman shows up. But when we're dealing with policies and programming, we can slow down and take the time. So the two need to come together in a good way, recognizing the differences of Indigenous people and their sovereignty. Thank you for hearing my words.
So true. So we will move to Ashely for her response.
Okay, well, so like I touched on earlier, go to nations around, work with them to incorporate like their ways and find an elder to provide a link to ceremony, like find someone who you might not know where to go, but find someone who does and have them link you, have them as like a consultant or like a worker or something, so they can like link you to different ceremonies and different ways that women can connect that way. Search for ways to incorporate like arts-based and traditional methods of healing into the way you provide service. So like using journaling, storytelling, arts-based methods when you deliver programming. So like when you're counseling a person, like using journaling or drawing techniques, like there's so many different activities and ways to do that. Then finding traditional things to do while working with folks, like our CFS people, they do like, we live on Rice Lake, so they do rice chucking. I think that's what how you call it. And while we're doing our visit and while they're asking us the questions and all the traumatizing stuff, where they're also teaching us about about the history of the Rice Lake and where the rice grows and how to harvest the rice. And so like, it's not just like that hard stuff, but also like ways to connect it to culture. Medicine planting and harvesting, like you can do all kinds of braiding sweetgrass, making smudge kits, but like having elders and knowledge keepers around to like guide a lot of that. Also, you could do like webinars and teach people how to incorporate ceremonies into their own lives. I think that's like one of the best things that I've ever done for myself, was learn how to incorporate my own rituals and ceremonies into my life, and kind of tweaking them to make it accessible to me, right? Having resident elders to give guidance, like I said, and as like an initial contact point for a person who might be needing an elder. You don't want to like overload people, but like having that initial ceremony and that initial contact sometimes is helpful, and then referring to other places or other nations that are closer, like different, whatever the case is. I think though we need to remove stigma, like a lot of stigma within the healthcare system, and the ways like we need to remember that there's a history of trauma, and our women in particular have been utilized in this medical system to be like guinea pigs and to like have procedures tested on us and all kinds of different things. So we need to be mindful that there are those like that blood memory of like trauma that has been there, and we might have reactions to certain procedures that we don't even understand ourselves. Like when I gave birth, I was having a lot of like reactions to the different procedures they were doing, and then when I was going for my epidural, they were asking questions about because my son was born on methadone. So they were asking questions about drugs and all kinds of invasive stuff, and like really asking foolish questions, like why I was on methadone for cocaine. And when I brought it up to them, they kind of like really got defensive and refused to do the epidural. So I think when we talk about gender-based violence, it's 16 days of activism against gender-based violence right now. And I think when we're talking about it, it's not just the men and the relationships we're in, but it's the institutions that are actually like committing acts of violence against us as well. It's the structures, it's the policy, it's so many different things. It's not just the people, and it's those structures and those institutions that make it acceptable for people to harm us. So I think we need to like do a lot of work in all areas of society, and not just focus solely on the people that are doing the harm in like acutely, but like the macro level stuff as well. So yeah, I think it's also important to offer Indigenous people a way to incorporate ceremony in ways that they want. So like maybe not offering all these different resources, but asking like, what do you want? And then going about problem solving that and finding that for that person. So yeah, those are my things.
Thank you, Ashely. Yeah, very, very true. We will move to Ann.
Hi, I just want to touch base what Sandy said. Where I work at the link in Winnipeg, a youth wanted to smudge. And because of this worker that takes on from what she learned from her elders, that you can't use while you're using 4 days or 4 days prior or 4 days after, like, and because of this individual, this youth couldn't smudge. The next thing you know, I look outside and he's ODing on the doorstep. So we need to stop and look around and protect these children. I think that's what needs to be done, is like, imagine what these children are going through. They're going through the same thing each and every one of us been through. We need to open up that doorway and close it and stop this gender-based violence from keeping happening throughout the generations and the generations to come. Without us taking action and helping us, like, where are we going to go? Where are these children going to be? They're going to be following each and every one of their footsteps once again, and there's not going to be a stop to it. What needs to be done is to be looking upon the children and helping them grow in a positive way, whereas there's a lot of Indigenous people, children that are in care, and they're taken away from their parents, and they need to be a part of their lives. They need their parents, they need their families, because without that, they just turn to violence themselves. They turn to drugs, they turn to whatever. Like, I see a lot of young Indigenous being put out on the street because they don't have a voice, because they don't have their family to back them up, because they live in group homes and stuff like that. We need to stop ripping those children away from their family and start healing the family from what needs to be healed. We need to go into each and every one of their houses. We need to go to each and every reserve, I do believe. Sure, this is good to have sweat rooms and everything in hospitals in places like this, but does it really help? Thank you.
Miigwetchan. Okay, so our third question is, oop, I lost it. Okay, got it. Where should service providers and policymakers focus their efforts in order to improve gender-based violence prevention services to best support Indigenous women, gender fluid, two-spirit, and transgendered peoples who are living with HIV? So I'll pop that in the chat as well.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a loaded one. So service providers and policymakers is, that's why I've been working in research also for the last like 17 years in HIV research. And, a lot of the research we do is to help us to create these educational and real life stories of our Indigenous women living with HIV to go on a paper to bring to policymakers to help make change, right? Where these policymakers will then have to send a new mandate of services to these service providers for them and say, hey, you guys need to probably work on this more than this, because this is coming out of like some really vital information from COVID for Indigenous women living with HIV and gender-based violence. Like nothing's changing here much. So, I mean, like preventative services. So I like what all the women have been saying here, and it's so important. And for us to actually have to help prevent gender-based violence. So like when I share my own story, and when I actually had my kids apprehended due to family violence, I remember a social work going to me, and she was right across from me, and my arms were like this, right? This is like 1996. And she says, you're not getting your kids back until you leave that man. Right? And I went, but I love him. He's my baby's dad, right? So on went, and I've heard it many here in Vancouver. I fought for about 6 months, and I tried to hide being in that relationship still. But they found out, and they kept my kids from me, and I was considered to be an unsafe mother because I was still with him. And from that middle of 96 to 2000, I was on the streets of the downtown east side trying to medicate because I was told I was a bad, unsafe mother of 6 children that, are still dealing with their trauma from being separated from me. They're in my life today. But, where was the prevention there when we have this child and family services, even though they've put an Aboriginal in front of it, right? And they brought in like a advisory of elders, but they're forcing those elders to get their bachelor social work, right? And it's like their prevention is not prevention. We still have youth, like was mentioned, that are trying to harm themselves, right? They don't want to feel the pain anymore. They don't want to be lonely anymore. They don't want to be brought up in white houses anymore. They do want to know their family and somehow. So a lot of this prevention can start with like Ministry of Child and Family. But a lot of this needs to start with our policymakers, because they're the ones who are actually setting the bar up here for service providers on what they can do and what they can't do. And unfortunately, a lot of service providers see what they can't do, and they kind of add on to it themselves, because unfortunately there's far too many that are there for a paycheck versus the ones that are there to actually really want to help, right? And I've seen it, I've been there, I've worked with so many, and it hurts. I've stayed quiet because there was times where my own financial life raising my kids in the early 2000s was at risk if I kind of didn't go with them, what they were doing, right? until I actually saw an executive director with a surplus, you guys, of over $500,000. And it was spent to redecorate the office and paint the walls and brand new furniture. That's when I walked into her office and I said, you give me a budget of this much to help women, and you go and spend $500,000 on painting a frickin' office? That was it for me. I said, you know, and I resigned from there after. And because I didn't want to be a part of like those kind of, is that preventive measures? Because it still goes on today. And that's like my whole point of this is saying is that the policymakers who are making all these changes, and it takes time for those changes to happen. It can take up to 5 years, right? And like Ashely was saying, we're in the middle of the 16 days of prevention and awareness against gender-based violence against all women. And we're here though also with Indigenous women living with HIV and around this pandemic. And I don't believe that's going to be our only pandemic. I believe there's going to be more that come. So we really need to take care of our women. And I like what Ashely said too about having like some strong women. You know, when you have a group of Indigenous women in a circle, how powerful. Like, look at this right now. This webinar itself is so powerful and it's online. But if Ashely was at home and like, you know, me and Sandy, we got a gift basket together. It was a pandemic, but me and her know we were going to keep safe. We have our mask on, our PPE. Let's go check on Ashely, because I haven't heard from her in about a month. You know, so I'm right down with that being a part of a solution during a pandemic. Absolutely. And what Ann was sharing, you know, my elder also told me about no smudge and all that, and Flo, if you, when I was using, you know, you can't come here for 4 days. But my elder also shared with me, it wasn't because of what was my body, you know, and I was drug infested. He was worried about his medicine. So he goes, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying, no, you can't come here, Flo. He goes, I want you to know that it's just me protecting my medicines that I help people with, that it's good for not to have too much of, you know, the dark and the negatives around the good medicine around those 4 days. So I don't know, that's what I was told. I wanted to share that because it's important for people to know that it's not being shamed, because I know us as Indigenous elders and teachers and medicine men and women, I have not met any that have ever shamed me in any way through my addiction with heroin and cocaine and everything, and all the overdoses that I've gone through too, you know. And I know there's too many Indigenous women suffering right now, knowing that, thinking, can they ever have their life back? You can have your life back. It does take time, and to not be so entrenched, but to have like, where's our safe place to go to? Where's the safe place for somebody to go to who wants to quit drugs? Where can she go to stay and get well? And can she stay there long, not just 30 days? Can she stay not 90 days? Can she stay a year? So those are things I think that really, we need those preventive measures now more than ever. Yes, we need housing, but we need housing just for Indigenous women to be able to be safe. I know I went off the road.
Miigwech, I love what you just said about, you know, telling the women that they can get their life back, because it must just be, it's so dim at some points that you don't think you can ever get there, but it's really encouraging. We will move to Sandy-Leo for their response.
Thank you, Flo, for that. And Anne, I really want to raise my hand to acknowledge the youth that you spoke of and their story that you brought into this, because it is important. Our words, our stories is our data. And we're changing research methodology around that. And I think the researchers and the policymakers, we should do research on policymakers and researchers together, because I think one informs the other, informs the programming, right? And so by doing the change that we're doing with research methodologies to bring them into Indigenous methodologies, And if we can do that with policymakers as well. And so that was very important for me to hear that story. It touched my heart because it revalidates why I stand up for the youth and those who are using. So many times, a lot of women, I says, would you like a smudge in the drop-in that I work at? And they say, oh no, I can't, my culture. And I said, you're not disrespecting your culture. We're taking care of yourself. I'm offering you this as the person who's bringing it so that you can start thinking in a good way. So it's about, for me, standing in my truth and being caring. And I'm not saying that we're not caring, but a lot of houseless people, when like the program I bring to AIDS Vancouver is called Smudging and Hugging. A lot of houseless people don't get a hug because they've soiled themselves and they've, they smell. And from our perspective, they're all, I don't care. I have a trans woman I've known since the 90s, and that person has a master's degree from the University of British Columbia. Something happened in their life, and they somehow fell through the cracks. They're houseless. They are very not, from perspective of other people, cleaned. They have a smell, a stench that's, some people go, and I see them and I said, do you want a hug? They, oh, honey, thank you. And big smile and all their teeth are gone and all. Basically, folks have to recognize that we're dealing with human beings. We don't need to fit in a system, but policymakers and service delivery folks ought to know what they can and cannot do and be flexible enough to flex a little bit beyond the box. You know, when you know the rules of the box, you open the box, you're able to go out of that box. And you need to understand that, because when you're dealing with people in crisis, they don't care about anything else but how you will treat the individual as a human being. So what should service provider and policymakers focus on their efforts? Recognizing that those of us who receive support or in need of support and help are the expert of what's happening. You may have read everything in theology. You may have your doctor's PhD attached to your name, but unless you have lived it and gone through it, you will never understand it spiritually and emotionally. And that is a teaching in itself and is a teacher. Those of us who go through this have expertise. And I beg for the policymakers, the researchers, the universities, and their service providers to listen to our voice. Number one thing, we know what we need. We know what we want in those crises. And I really like the fact that when we gathered together at one point and we talked about different things and different little kits and different little tools and preparing. For those of us who, when I saw that and I heard that, I did not know I could do that. Have a friend, like a trusted friend, I could give them some money. I could give them some things that I need, having an emergency kit if I need to leave and things. I did not know that that could be done, nor was it ever talked about, right? So the more we as Indigenous women who have lived or living that experience are listened to, the better we'll prepare policymakers and service providers to serve us. And one of the things that I say, you never know. Those of us who are sitting behind a desk, making the decisions, running the programs, whatever, you never know when you're going to find yourself on the other side of that desk and be one of the person who needs those services. So think about that if you're a service provider. Think about that if you're a policymaker. Only in the Western traditions that we put those separations in. We're a community. What affects one affects everybody. And so okay, I recognize I took 5 minutes. Thank you. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We'll move to Ashely.
So I think the child welfare system is a big thing. Like a lot of it stems from the destruction of our vision of the family. My son has autism and was starting to like talk before they took him. And then like while he wasn't seeing me, he degressed completely. And then when they were finally forced to allow him to have more access due to reasons that had nothing to do with them allowing it or wanting to allow it, he started to like get better. He stopped having tantrums. He started behaving differently. He's happy. He sleeps at night. So like we really need to repair the family and advocate for that, because like back in the day, our families was like the whole community. Like we were like all together. The community raised the children and the grandparents took care of the children while the parents went out and provided for the children. And like there are those dynamics and norms like that got lost through colonization. And I think we need to repair a lot of those dynamics and find a lot of those ways back to our culture, and get our like Indigenous or like our nation, like mine is Ojibwe, so like our nation's version of family. So yeah, I think that's that kind of advocacy and policy, like I guess not policy work, but like work to work towards that is necessary. And I think in order to get that, to achieve that, we need to have Indigenous women and two-spirited, all Indigenous people, we need to be the ones to lead that movement and to lead that work. So yeah, I think finding out where people are experiencing violence in institutions, like in research, I do a lot of research, and I think we don't ask enough questions about, we ask a lot of like surface level questions and questions about people's lives that we want to know personally and are nosy about, but we never ask questions about like where people are experiencing violence in schools, hospitals, healthcare systems, child welfare systems. And like, we need to provide real actionable changes to function better as a society and prevent a lot of this abuse that's happening. We need to rupture patriarchal white supremacist systems of oppression and ideas of oppression. Awareness and storytelling, I think awareness raising is so important. And I think we can do that through storytelling and telling our stories. Oftentimes, like there was this video I'm working on and it's based on my story, but I wouldn't call it my story because they sugarcoated everything, and that's not how I was treated. I was treated horribly. So I think the reality of our stories are never told, so often they're changed to make it more acceptable for society and the public. So sometimes I think sometimes the public needs to hear some of that triggering, traumatizing stuff, and maybe it can help kind of bring awareness, but also do it in a strength-based way where people feel the shock, but then see the strength. We need to support Indigenous women to mobilize and lead movements, offer harm reduction to Indigenous women who use drugs, because like was said, we get our backs, like people turn their backs on us when we use drugs because it's against the cultural norms. And those cultural norms are brought around by ideas of colonization. I don't think that they were around before. I don't think they had any issues around drug use in ceremony before drug use was a problem and given to us by white men. So I think we need to understand whole histories and work on like whole societal pieces before I think we can change things. And when you work on bigger level things, the change trickles down. So we'll see it in the public. So yeah, it's my piece.
Thank you, Ashely. And look to Ann.
Hi, with the service providers and policy makers, I do believe that with the service providers, they really don't look at the policies that are made. They go above and beyond, and they take it into their own consideration to put in their own policies. Like they make up this or that, given like, okay, say this, their job goes to their head. So they turn around and say, no, this is how it's supposed to be. Like in a welfare situation, or CFS or whatever, like, or even in group homes and stuff, or even in shelters. They turn around and they see it how they want to see it. So they apply whatever they want to apply to it. So they need to start looking at the policies and make sure that they're followed 100%. I remember one day in Ottawa, when I was living in Ottawa and I was using, and I ended up, there was this safe house for women to go in there and use, and have safe supplies and everything. And one night, some male was trying to fight one of the girls that were living there. I never personally lived there. I just used to go in and get safe supplies, but she was getting beaten up by this male. So I stepped in and I shooed the guy away. And the next day I went to go see if I could get some clean supplies, and I was locked out. I told my story to people that were from NATE out in Edmonton, and this is what they came up with. So this is what is happening to our people, is we're getting locked out. That's a rubber against a building, and a little Indian girl being stopped at the doorway that they can't get in. So that's happening throughout every service providing, like hospitals, everything. We're getting shut down. We're getting turned away. St. Boniface Hospital. There's so many women that I know of that are getting turned away. One of my good friends, she had infection in her toe. They told her to leave the building. She needed like she needed medication and everything, and they wouldn't provide it because she was Indigenous. They were trying to blame her for taking pictures, but she was just writing down what was being recorded. She never took any pictures. The security guard came and asked her for her phone to see her pictures and everything. Like totally went against her well-being. Nobody's allowed to go and look into a person's phone, irregardless of security officer. So it's still happening today. That was during COVID. And like, I think that they need to stop taking it in their own hands and thinking that their way is the best, because it's not. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. So true. Okay, we're on to our last question. Okay, I'm going to copy it. So to Flo, what values are important for creating safe and inclusive spaces for Indigenous women, gender fluid, transgender, and two-spirit peoples?
Thanks, Sally. I just really need to share that this panel is, you guys are so strong and wonderful, and I just love you all, everything you're sharing. You're such a storyteller, Ann. What values are important for creating safe and inclusive spaces for us, all of us, and two spirits and transgender? Geez, values, you know. I learned a long time ago, like a lot of values. I was raised in Catholic school, right? Both my grandmothers went to residential school. So my mother raised me very strict Catholic out here in Vancouver. And I didn't even know I was Indigenous till I was 17, if you could. That's when she moved me to Winnipeg. When I found out in an EI office looking for a job, a woman asked me if I was Native, and I said, you know, I think I might be. Right? And 17 years old, right? So those values that my mom raised me on was shame, embarrassment, being of Indigenous, right? You know, we were French. My dad said we were French. That was all there was to it. He never taught us the language though, but we were French. So those values, my core values, were shame and blame, you know, and all that. Like I really didn't self-identify with who I was. I had teachers that would ask me about, you know, Aboriginal and Native stuff, and I'm looking at them like, you know, don't know, had no clue, right? And gradually, as I started to learn in Winnipeg, and I took an employment and training program, and there was an elder, Thelma Mead, from Winnipeg. She was the first elder that taught me about smudge, and how she talked, like she was so, her values she taught me was love, caring, respect. She taught me safety, caring, knowledge, wisdom, spirituality. She taught me. And I'm so grateful for that. And I got to bring that home. My mom wasn't too crazy about it. But, you know, eventually my mom saw, even as I raised my children, and in the morning before school and before I went to work, we would smudge. But my mom was my caregiver for my younger children. And she would come in and she would start coughing. Oh my gosh, there's that witchcraft. And, you know, but she'd hear us pray after always. And, you know, after, I don't know, maybe 6 months, she didn't do that coughing anymore. She would come up and she wouldn't actually judge what we were doing anymore, you know? And I never pushed her to ever feel pushed into it. But I told her I won't tolerate you telling my kids that it's wrong. Because this is something you didn't learn about, but I'm trying to learn for all of us, right? So the values today that are important for creating this safe, inclusive space for our Indigenous women, I believe need to start there. I don't think from a person with a degree is going to be able to teach me about spirituality, about humility, right? About caring, love, safety. I don't believe that they can have the empathy, right? Similar to what Elder Sandy was saying in regards to, like, you know, the researchers, the PhDs. Yes, I've met many of them and they're my allies in a lot of ways. But without that lived experience and knowing that pain from one Indigenous woman to another, from one woman living with HIV to another, hearing that you're diagnosed with HIV by a doctor is trauma. And as peers, we understand that for one another. Same with hepatitis C. Hep C, yes, has been cleared, but there's still problems with people's bodies. I'm dealing with it today. And for us to really understand the importance of creating that safety and that nurturing and the healing and all those special values that we need, they need to be upfront at every organization that has an Indigenous program in their organization. Those values need to be front and center for us to actually feel safe enough to go there. And I don't know about you, but I know that I need to know that a place is credible too. I need to know that that's okay. You guys have an Indigenous program. I want to see up on I'll go to their website. I want to see the elders that are seeing over it. I want to see like it done in a good way. And then I'm going to feel safe enough to probably give them a call to get the help I need. Right? And that's what is probably some of the most important values that go into society for a lot of different people, ethnicities, religions, you know, and come on, love and respect. One thing that hurt me when I did, I'm going to share this story. I did an anti-violence group with women, and I went to bring this around like Metro Vancouver. So I'd have a big flip chart, and I was taught, I went to, an elder taught me about the medicine wheel, and it took about a week of training with me with the elder. And I learned like the 7 concepts of the medicine wheel. And I would use that as a tool of what a healthy relationship looked like versus an unhealthy relationship. So going to these women, we would actually brainstorm the spiritual, the emotional, the physical, and the mental aspects of an unhealthy relationship. You know, that medicine wheel was completely, the whole flip chart was full of like under emotional, fear, blame, shame, you know, under the physical, bruises, broken bones, jail, child apprehension. It was covered. And then I would say to these women, we would smudge after that. And I said, okay, now I'm going to put up a healthy relationship. And it would be like crickets. You know, women were like not saying what a healthy relationship looked like. And then eventually I would actually start coaxing them a little bit using like, how do you feel about your children? And that's when things would start coming up, because that's a healthy relationship too. But the 2 things that wouldn't be shown up there on that healthy relationship every single time was love and respect. Those 2 values were the most that always had to be kind of like really kind of coaxed out of them, right? And I would like draw like a big heart, and then somebody go, oh, love, right? And that still sits with me today, and I don't think it would change much today with different groups that I would still be doing it with. But that's like over the last 25 years. But I'm sure I went over 5 minutes. I will let the next one go.
Thanks, Flo. That's so true. Wow. We will go to Ashely.
Okay, so I think the values that are needed are trust. Like, we need to trust you. And like how I usually gain people's trust is like, I don't ask them about like to tell me about everything. I ask them simple questions. I tell them about myself. I kind of ask them surface level things, and I ease into the conversations I start with women so that it's not like invasive. And I find that's like how you can gain trust to then start conversing about the hard stuff. Accommodation is important, and accessibility. Our people are not educated the same as others a lot of places, like, or we have to go travel if we want the same education. Like, there's all different situations depending on where your reserve is or where you live. So I think accommodation and accessibility and really understanding the individual person's needs in terms of those things is important. Acceptance, just accepting people. Individuality. We're all unique people with unique stories, cultures, practices, likes, dislikes, and all that needs to be reflected in the way that you work with us. There needs to be an understanding that we have, like, a lot of us have children and we want to keep them and out of the system if possible. So like having ways that women can include their children in programming and bring them along, that's so important. Smudging the room, having art, drumming, having fires make people feel really safe. And making the place just feel safe. And understanding the true histories that our people have experienced, and truly reflecting on those things and how they may impact the way a person is going to engage with you. And understanding is needed of like that generational trauma and what's happened to our people and how that affects us and how we may react in medical or like in situations in services, like maybe sometimes we might get violent or something, and it's not because we're violent people, it's because like we've experienced violence and it's what we know. So like understanding some of those complexities is important. Acknowledgement of our stories is the most important thing though. And I think often what we really need is just for someone to say like, I see you, I hear you, I'm with you. And the rest is problem solving and trial and error and just really like asking people what they want and need. And when you want to find out what makes a place safe and inclusive, you need to ask the people who are going to be entering the space. And I think that's the most important piece. So thanks.
Miigwech, I wrote down what you said. You have the 3 A's: acceptance, accommodation, and accessibility. Like, in a nutshell. That's really good. Miigwech. We'll move to Ann.
My values the values that I think are important for creating a safe and exclusive space is trust. You have to trust that person in order to be able to be safe. Understanding that the things that we have went through and our ancestors went through and our elders went through, we have to understand and heal from that. We have to accept the harshness that was put onto us by our family, by our mom and dad, by our grandparents, because we have to accept that what they went through and they didn't heal from that. So we have to, by us being able to move forward, we're the ones who have to heal. We're the ones who have to stop it. Because we have to accept that it needs to stop here. I think a lot of people don't think of us as humans. They treat us worse than humans. They don't think our blood is the same. Whereas it is. We all bleed the same. From what I gather, we are all family. And people need to understand that. And they need to care for their next person. Like, why can't we just hold hands in unity all around the world? Why does it have to be a color that stops us from being that next friend? It's devastating that how the world breaks up, and meanwhile we're all the same. I think love, we need to love thy neighbor. We need to love outside of the family. We need to hug and say good morning to people. We need to show that we could get over this and that they're not going to stop us by having their racism or their values in front of us and making it a barrier. So it's up to us to rise. It's up to us to create the values that we want in our lives. and take charge. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Ann. And we'll move to Sandy-Leo.
Hi, thank you. I'm stopped the video because I have a guest that came into the home, my partner, and I don't want him to see our people or to be seen. So I apologize for that. I love what everybody has said about values, but specifically values and action. How does that look like? You could speak of love, but if you love women and men, but not the transgendered person, uh-oh, right? If you love the little babies and the little girls, but you don't love the men that are using drugs or the women that are sex workers, uh-oh. So for me, a value comes with an action. How do you demonstrate that value? It's as important as having that value. Compassion. What does that look like? Empathy. What does that look like? Right? Active listening instead of injecting ourselves into situations. What does that look like? But the biggest for me is your biases. Our own personal biases can play a role in how we deliver our caring, our support. And at times they need to be checked at the door. And if we can't, then it's our responsibility to remove ourselves from those situations. No policy, no nothing. If you know that you're biased towards a houseless person, a person that's using drugs, a person that's sex worker, then you remove yourself. There's a lot of agencies who think that sex workers are not at risk of gender-based or sexualized violence. There's a lot of people who think that trans women are not women. So if you have those biases, you need to remove yourself from that. You need to be honest with yourself. So honesty with yourself is as important as all the others. And so it's about really assessing yourself for me in terms of value. How effective can you be in that situation? How ineffective can you be in that situation, right? We place an emphasis a lot of times on funding and paychecks and honorariums and things like that. And I'm guilty of that. I want to know where and how I can pay my rent or buy food. But also, I have a responsibility as an older adult to know where I could be effective there and not effective. And that came for me from years of asking myself this. Am I the right person for this situation? Am I the right person to do this? And why? The other part of values for me is problem solving oriented. In other words, I say a lot of times, no problems, just solutions. So we come up and we speak about an issue. We ought to be able to also speak about how to resolve an issue, how to go about it. That's always been my motto. Okay, now that you've told me what's wrong, tell me what we can do to change it. Right. It's weird to be in that position to be able to say that because it took me over 30 years of coming back from my own violence. And I had to realize that even with my words, because I was a survivor of violence and because it was so normalized in my family, that I could have been and have been one of those verbal abusers as well. To realize that our words are as powerful as someone said about getting a beating. Trigger warning here, sorry about that. So violence, gender-based violence and sexualized violence for me is also our own service providing support. You know, how we react to a situation and what we say is as important. So with that in mind, that's why I speak of compassion and problem-solving orientation. Because a lot of times when you're in that situation and you show up, You don't want to be told there's this service or that service. You want to hear how you're going to be safe, how are you going to be taken care of. You know, you're going to have a shelter to stay in. You can have a meal, and people in this environment are the same as you. They're caring, they're passionate. They've went through this. They understand it, right? The rest comes after the moment of crisis. So take the time to be compassionate. Love and caring is everything we've said, right? Thank you for hearing those words.
Thank you, Sandy-Leo. I just wrote down what you said as well. A value comes with an action, because otherwise, it's just words. And I think that's so true, and, really wise words to live by. Miigwech. So I just put in the chat there. We are open for the Q&A session, or section of our session. So you can go ahead and type any questions or even comments you have for the panelists in the chat, or you can raise your little hand and we'll unmute you. Otherwise, you can private message Savannah or I, and we will read your questions aloud. So we'll just give it a minute, and then we will get to the Q&A. Okay, I've got a private chat. So the question is, can any of you discuss the implications that stigma has on Indigenous health and people living with HIV? I'll put it in the chat.
Guess we'll stay in the same order. You want?
Sure, or you know what, whoever wants to answer, we don't need to keep it in the circle.
So sharing a story in regards to Indigenous women living with HIV around stigma with HIV,
Yes.
basically. Oh,
Yep.
yeah. Oh, I wish we had an all-day webinar to share all the stories. All mine anyhow. I almost died, like I mentioned, 5 years ago. I was treated so badly, similar to some of my sister's stories here in regards to even trying to get an IV in my arm. It's still going on today. There's always stories. I live right across the street from a hospital, and unfortunately, I witness it every day of them throwing people out on the street here. And people might think that Vancouver's super warm, but yeah, when it's -2 or -3 right now, that's still really cold for somebody that's used to this climate out here. And not to mention when you actually maybe have an infection or you're sick. And with HIV, there's so many related illnesses that go with HIV that when we're actually not, when we have to deal with the healthcare providers giving us stigma towards us being being Indigenous, being HIV positive, maybe a past drug user or sex worker, and that necessarily makes us okay that you can treat us like shit.
Yeah.
I worked for the same health authority for 2.5 years that treated me like crap for so many days until I finally spoke up and said, you know what? The same paycheck that you get, I get. And all of a sudden that nurse got my IV in like that. It was in my arm and off she went after about 5 tries, right? And for Indigenous women living with HIV, we actually deserve to have healthcare providers say, what's your name? Or do you have a special name? Or where's your community? Not just like, I was just bed D. That's it. They asked about my friends that came to visit me. They asked about my co-workers that came to visit me, asked them their names and everything. I just lied in the bed there while these healthcare providers were questioning all my friends and coworkers, but not once asked me anything about myself. Not once in 11 days. And that was 5 years ago. So here we are. That was 2017, 2018 when that went on. And here we are in 2022, and this is still going, and it's alive and well. HIV stigma, especially towards Indigenous women. And if you put in gender-based violence in there and so many other aspects of where they live, their neighbors, their housing, their workers, everything, you know, that's what's still going on today. Thanks.
Thanks, Flo. We'll go to Ashely.
Well, I think the biggest implication of stigma is like death, really. Like stigma has been killing us in so many different ways, whether it's HIV, drug use, like it's all stigma kills, like, let's be real. And I think other implications are that people don't get the health care that they need. And so then it ends up killing. Like, so in a roundabout way, like it's just destructive. And I think like people in my situation, I work in this field. So I was really scared to ask for help, to go to like my peers when I needed support, because it wasn't just going to an organization and asking for help. It was going to my friend and my coworker and like people that I knew and saying like, this is where I'm at and I need help. And then what ended up happening was I suffered for it, but not only I suffered, my child suffered and my whole family suffered because I didn't get help at the time that I should have. And I didn't get help at the time I should have because I was so stigmatized in the hospital from giving birth and then being called on CAS on that I didn't want. Once I got rid of them, I didn't want them back in my life. So I didn't go and get help. And then it ended up almost killing my own son. So I think we need to like it's the implications are so drastic, and unless you live them, it's hard to really understand how detrimental they are to people's lives. So yeah.
So true. And Ann.
I just want to share like what went on when I just went to the hospital. I was in the hospital for a week, and because of my regimen that I take for my HIV, my medication interferes with quite a few antibiotics and everything. And a lot of doctors or nurses or they don't check. So when I asked one of the nurses, like I had a roommate, I tried to be discreet. It wasn't possible because there was just a curtain between us. And I asked her, I says, could you check out, see if this anything what you're giving me interferes with this medication? Oh, what's that for? I says, could you go please check? They wouldn't check until I told them that it was for my HIV, which my roommate finally heard when I went outside to the washroom. When I was finally able to go out and walk, I came back on the poster coming into our room, big HIV letters on the poster. I had nurses, sure it was influenza, but there's a lot of people that were coming in before that poster, that HIV was put on the poster, that they were coming in without gloves on. They're coming in without a gown on. And once that HIV was put up, they got all masked up, gown, gloves to come and treat me. I was so devastated that this is still going on with the stigma that and they still never really told me that the medication that they're giving me was okay with my medication. So I don't even know if my medication is working or not. And I still have to phone my doctor and find out because they gave me this medication for 2 weeks and it could be interfering with my HIV meds. So that kind of stigma needs to stop, and I can't believe it's still going on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And that's unbelievable that happened to you like last week. It's just that lack of education is so detrimental. And
Add something? Well, I was in HIV Edmonton when those are the first stores I ever went through. And that's when I first started being an activist and telling my story and stuff like that. If it where was I going? Oh yeah, they every 2 weeks they teach the student nurses HIV 101. They'd have a speaker come in, one of the people that were involved with HIV Edmonton, and go tell her story to them. They'd have a blanket ceremony for stigma applied with that HIV 101, and that blanket ceremony is so powerful. It gives a scenario of people that are like have the stigma and apply it to a person that is HIV positive. They have one person sitting in the middle and people standing around in a circle with a blanket, and each scenario that's written, the person goes and lays the blanket on that person, and the heaviness of the stigma that they witness that's placed onto us. And then after all the blankets are placed, like this includes the bus driver, your family members, everybody, right? And nurses, doctors. And then once all the blankets are placed, they do a different scenario where they're accepted with being a person living with HIV, and that stigma is removed. So they start peeling off those blankets. I think something like that needs to happen in order to get rid of the stigma on HIV. I've been trying to get that scenarios and everything. I know I could probably write it up, but I think something like that needs to happen all over Canada, all over the world, and it needs to show people what it's like to be stigmatized with a person that's living with HIV.
yeah, there needs to be far better education for
Yes.
service providers, doctors, healthcare professionals. Sandy, do you want to add any last words? We're nearing the close here. Oh, can we hear her? I can't.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yep.
Okay.
Awesome.
So the implication for two-spirit people or transgendered people, I'll use my experience and I'll give a trigger warning before. I was in a relationship in early 90s and my finger got broken. And by the time I went into emergency at St. Paul's Hospital, oh, by the way, it's great. Old St. Paul's Hospital is very biased towards Indigenous people. I identified myself as an Indigenous transgendered woman. And 3 things that came back to me was, oh, you're Indigenous? And I looked at them and I went, and what do you think Indigenous people look like? Right? The second one, the nurse comes back after, I went assessed and the doctor assessed me and they're going to do a plaster on my finger. The nurse comes back, a queer nurse, a male gay nurse comes back and says, oh, the doctor is on call and is a student doctor finishing their doctorship. They've seen a lot of women's transplanted breasts for trans women, but they've never seen the bottom part. So that's the trigger warning. And they want to see that. So I went in for a broken finger, and the freaking curiosity of doctors treated me otherwise. And yes, it is shocking. And yes, because I have a voice, I complained to the hospital and it went all the way up to the governor. They dismissed me. They dismissed me. They did not address it. They did not address it, and it made me angry. It made me really angry and advocate more and more and more. And some of that ism happens, not just verbally. I mean, the service provider is providing service. I never thought that in a hospital I would be unsafe, right? I never thought that a hospital would be unsafe. I go to a hospital to receive care and I get stigmatized and I get that other word. To me, that was violent. That was a form of violence. That kind of curiosity towards a trans woman is violence. There's no two ifs and buts about it. And from the providers. So what is important in this to me is to continue our advocacy from our strength base. Continue. Yes, the hospital now offers ceremonies and all. It's always from a heteronormative position. As trans women, as a transgendered, quote unquote, elder, because people recognize me as that, I just say a knowledge keeper, there is a lot of trans misogyny from the community of healers, from the community of elders, from our community in general. And that's harsh to recognize because it creates a distrust. I'm always hyper vigilant, even with my communities, even with my members, I'm always hyper vigilant of what's going to happen next. Oh no, how are you going to hurt me again? And can you accept my truth? So it goes back to acceptance all the time and voicing our experiences because our stories is our data. We're not a number, we're storytellers. We're not homogenized Indigenous. Not all of us have dark skin and slanted eyes or big brown lips like a lot of people think. Not all of us have long hair. Some of my family elders are getting bald a little bit, you know, so we need to destigmatize that ideology of what an Indigenous person looks like or is. I can go on all day long. I'm so passionate about that one place. And that's just one incident. There are many incidents of breaking confidentiality on Indigenous women and trans women, where they come out of the treating room and things are said that people didn't know or your partners didn't know, right? One trans woman, when they came, I brought her there and the daughter comes back and her partner did not know because they weren't living together that she was transgender and didn't have the operation, and they disclosed that. So that created more violence. So for me, we need to go talk to the service providers, the hospitals, the healthcare providers, and give them the horror stories so they get shocked by it, and then we can give them ways of going at it and how to change that. But if we don't tell the stories, not because we want to live in a victimized position, but rather show this is who we are, this is what's happened, and this is where we're going, and this is what you ought to do and need to do to improve your service providing. I'm always thinking that way, you know, because it's important not only to shine a light on the darkness, but to also give our light and say, this is what we need. This is what needs to happen, right? And I've dedicated my life in doing that, so I'm not going to stop. Thank you.
Miigwech. Wow. Well, thank you all so much for that dedication that you give every day and that perseverance, compassion. You're all so incredible. And, you know, I'll speak like for Savannah and myself. The reason why we do this kind of work is for people like you, and we're just so inspired by you. So, miigwech. I'm just going to move to show Devin's work. I'm going to pin her so you can see sort of, oh, I'll let her finish the thought, but if you can like zoom out and just see the incredible all of your words are being captured, and this is real-time resources. So pretty amazing. Thank you so much, Devin. Wow, cool. Okay, so we're a little bit over time, but that's okay. I will ask Elder Betty to close us off.
Thank you.
I tried copying and pasting. If you can, sorry, Sally or Savannah.
I smudge again. Send our ancestors the rest. Miigwech Jimanto, Miigwech Jimamaki, Jimanto. We humbly say a plea of gratitude to give us strength to carry a nurturing spirit like Mother Earth for all people. We ask our prayers to fly into the four directions, O Great Spirit, to the east, and gratitude for the sunshine. Great Spirit, we ask for a blessing from the south for clean water to nourish our body and spirits. To the west, a gentle end to each day. And to the north, strength of family and community and respect of all things in our lives. Protect our families and our homes. Creator, we are your children. We are small and weak, but we are willing, and we are here. We will stand up and be counted. Miigwech Jimanto, Miigwech Jimamaki. Thank you. Chimiigwech, Chimiigwech.
Chimiigwech. Well, thank you all so very much, really, truly, for joining. And it was a really powerful 2 hours. So please take good care of yourself and be really proud of the work that you're all doing. Miigwech.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Miigwech. Love you, woman.
Take care, everybody.